All right, in this video, I'm gonna give you my top 5 tips for painting flowers. If you're new to the channel, then welcome to Paint Coach. My name is Chris Fornatero, and I am here to help simplify oil painting so that you can get better faster. So there are a lot of ways to go about painting flowers, and there's a lot of painters out there that, specialize in painting flowers, and they all have different techniques. So I'm not gonna be talking so much about technique here. I'm gonna talk about the core principles that I feel like all their methods share that allow them to produce good paintings. I feel understanding those things are much more important than specific techniques. So let's jump on in with tip number 1, which is come up with a good design. Before you start painting, think about how you're going to be arranging these flowers on your canvas. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. They could be in a vase. You could show the whole vase. It could be, a close-up. Are the leaves and the kind of the background, are they in focus? Are they not? Think about the composition. What is your focal point? Is there a certain flower that you want to be the main focal point? Are things arranged so that the viewer's eye is led to that focal point? Also, do you have an interesting pattern of shapes? With flowers, it's very easy to, have each flower the same size, the same distance apart, and you don't want that. You want to arrange these big shapes. You really want to be thinking about the composition abstractly, not even thinking of them as flowers, just thinking of them as their shapes and what is an interesting way to arrange these shapes that is pleasing to the eye. Also, think about the lighting. Is the lighting creating distinct light and shadows that's going to make it easier for you to convey the form and shape of these flowers? This is why a lot of painters, when they set up a still life, they'll have one main light shined on the flowers. So there's a distinct light source, there's distinct lights, there's distinct shadows. Now, speaking of form, that leads me to tip number 2, which is form. The form of the flower. No matter what technique you're using or how simple you're painting or how detailed you're painting, never lose the general form of the flower. That's what I feel is going to help the most in communicating that this is a flower. And with flowers, there's so many petals and folds and little details that it's very easier than other subjects to lose this form as you paint. For example, with these roses, there's definitely a cylinder form to them, and I want to make sure that I identify that form at the beginning, establish it, and hold on to it throughout the painting as I develop and add on details. Nailing this form is so important. Even when I did this small little 6x8 study of the roses, very simply painted, not a lot of detail, I used a big brush, but it still works because I made sure to hold on and communicate that cylinder form of the roses. I didn't need to go into a bunch of detail with every single little petal and every, single little shadow and line. Just getting that basic form will bring you along so far. This is even true for other flowers that maybe have more distinct petals that are, coming out. A rose is pretty compact, but even like a sunflower that has all these petals sprayed out, I still want to understand and identify the big form that all the petals are creating and translate that with light and shadow shapes. All right, tip number 3 is pay very close attention to values. More specifically, the big values at the beginning. This comes back to capturing that form at the beginning and holding on to it throughout the painting. This can be very challenging, for flowers in particular, breaking them down into 2 or 3 basic values is difficult. This is why I decided to do a wash underpainting for these flowers. I just used a lot of paint thinner and a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to just block out and kind of map out the values here to keep me on track. I even got some paper towel and dipped it in a little paint thinner and wiped away some of the brightest areas. If you have to at this point, squint your eyes when you're looking at your subject. That helps get rid of color. Or if you're working from a photograph, put it in black and white and just focus on the values, the value relationships, what's darker than what. Find your darkest value, find your lightest value, and then compare the values that fall in between that. And keep it simple. Don't get more than 2 or 3 values, especially in the rose itself. Here, I just blocked it out with 2 values, dark and light. And this is difficult. Like, you're gonna have to simplify. You're gonna have to get rid of detail. Like, I know you're gonna see a whole bunch of little subtle value shifts within the shadows, and they're like, oh, well, what about this crease of dark that comes into light? You got to simplify it. You got to squint your eyes and be like, all right, I just see this big blob of white here, and this side is a big blob of dark, and, you know, map it out. And I hadn't painted flowers in a while, and I didn't realize how easy it is to get fooled with white flowers in particular on how dark the shadows are. You know, I think it kind of can play tricks on you, and you see this white flower and you see the shadows, and they don't seem as dark as they really are. So keep an eye out for that when you're painting white flowers in particular, to make sure you establish those dark shadows dark enough, especially in the beginning. Because when you get to those lighter areas, you know, those white areas of the petals that are getting hit with light, and you want them to, you know, be really bright and glowing, they're not going to glow if you haven't established your darks dark enough. I've talked about this before, you know, your lights are only going to be as light as the darks are around it. Also, it's a lot easier to lighten paint as you go opposed to darkening it. So don't be afraid to make things too dark at first, or to paint too many dark areas, because you can always lighten them. And you should be doing this with, you know, relatively thin paint. You don't need to do it in a wash, but paint that's thinned out a little bit with paint thinner, it's going to set up quicker. It's going to be easy to paint over top of it and add on lighter values. Just so you know, I painted these roses in about an hour or so, completely alla prima. I didn't wait for anything to dry. And if you want to see the full version of that tutorial, it is on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. All right, tip number 4 is don't be afraid to block out very big shapes at the beginning of the painting. It's kind of what I was talking about before with the underpainting. Even when you move on to using color and thicker paint, I highly recommend starting with big shapes and then working to smaller shapes. This is where it's going to be very easy to lose the big general form that you established early on, because you're going to see a bunch of details, you're going to see subtle value shifts, you're going to see those highlights in the shadows, and you're going to want to put in everything. But really show some restraint and use a big brush and identify the big shapes first. Once you have those, be like, all right, I'm going to squint a little bit less. I'm going to see, you know, what I see. You know, this is even true with the sunflowers, where there's a lot of very distinguished petals. I still want to block it out with big shapes first. I feel a lot of people underestimate how easy it is to cut back into big shapes to make them smaller, more distinguished shapes. And I'm also not worried about painting every single petal. Again, I want to pick out the main petals, you know, the ones that stand out, the ones that when I squint my eyes, like, oh, that one petal is really hitting with the light, and suggest only the ones that I need to. So again, don't be afraid to block things out with big shapes. It's going to keep you on track so you don't lose the form as you add on detail. Now, speaking of detail, that leads me to tip number 5, which is don't feel obligated to paint every little thing that you see. This is where squinting comes in handy a lot. It's very easy to lose that good form that you established early on in this stage when you're starting to pull out more subtle details. I recommend, you know, squinting your eyes less and only pulling out the details that you need. You know, be selective about it. Try and see how little you can get away with. You know, you will drive yourself crazy if you immediately go in with a tiny little brush and try and get every single little fold that you see. You know, always be squinting your eyes, always be stepping back. Whenever you put in, you know, a different value, make sure it's still working and communicating the overall form. You're gonna see a lot of highlights within the shadows here and a lot of lighter values in those nice dark shadows that you put in earlier, and you want to be very careful with those and don't get tricked and don't make it lighter than it really is. Very common mistake is people see all this reflected light in the shadows of the petal and they put it all in, and all of a sudden their shadows aren't reading like shadows and their flowers losing their form because it doesn't have, you know, a shadow, and the form becomes very ambiguous and you can't really, you know, read what's going on, which causes them to add on more detail and try and pile on more paint, and it just becomes like a big thick mess, and that's not what we want. If you find this happening to you, you feel like you're just trying to solve your problems by adding more details and more petals and more folds and it's just not working, grab a big clean brush and just, you know, drag it over those really complicated areas and simplify it. You know, bring it back to the beginning stages, you know, start again from dark and light. Make it work with, you know, very few big brush strokes, and then have at it again, being conscious not to lose that form as you develop the detail. So painting flowers, in my opinion, is very difficult, but hopefully with these tips, you can paint better flowers. Now, if you're just beginning with oil paints and you're like, Chris, where do I start? Where do I begin? Start with my Foundations of Oil Painting course. It's got everything you need to get going oil painting. After that, I suggest my Patreon page. I like to think of that as a gym to exercise the skills that you learned in the course. There I got, tons, like over 50 or 60 painting video tutorials. If you want to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, a lot of my plein air work, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.